Picture this. It's November 1961. The streets of Philadelphia are absolute chaos. Traffic is gridlocked for miles. Police officers are working double shifts, their radios crackling with reports of mayhem across the city. Store windows are packed with desperate shoppers, and the sidewalks are so crowded that people can barely move. This isn't a natural disaster or a citywide emergency. This is what would eventually become known as Black Friday. But here's the thing that might shock you. Black Friday wasn't created by retailers. It wasn't some brilliant marketing scheme cooked up in a corporate boardroom. And it definitely wasn't called Black Friday because stores went from being in the red to being in the black financially. That's one of the biggest myths in retail history. The real origin of Black Friday is darker, more chaotic, and far more interesting than anything you've been told. It's a story that involves frustrated police officers, overwhelmed city infrastructure, and a retail phenomenon that spiraled completely out of control before anyone knew how to handle it. Today, I'm going to take you back to where it all really began, not in some corporate strategy meeting, but on the overcrowded, traffic-jammed streets of Philadelphia in the early 1960s. This is the untold story of how America's biggest shopping day got its name, and why the truth has been buried under decades of retail marketing spin. To understand the real origin of Black Friday, we need to travel back to Philadelphia in the late 1950s and early 1960s. This was a different America. Eisenhower was president, the suburbs were booming, and the post-war economic expansion was in full swing. But Philadelphia was facing a unique problem that no other major American city had quite experienced to this extent. You see, Philadelphia sits in a very special geographic position. It's perfectly positioned between New York City and Washington, D.C., making it a natural stopping point for travelers. But more importantly for our story, Philadelphia was surrounded by some of the most affluent suburbs in America, places like Main Line, Montgomery County, and South Jersey. These weren't just any suburbs. These were home to some of the wealthiest families on the East Coast. The city's downtown shopping district, centered around Market Street and Broad Street, had become the premier shopping destination for the entire region. Department stores like Wanamaker's, Lit Brothers, Strawbridge and Clothier, and Gimbel's had turned Philadelphia into what retail historians now call the shopping capital of the Mid-Atlantic. But there was a problem brewing, and it had everything to do with timing. In the 1950s, most Americans still worked 6-day weeks. Sunday shopping was virtually non-existent due to blue laws that kept most stores closed. This meant that for suburban families wanting to do serious shopping in the city, Saturday was really their only option. And there was one Saturday each year when this system would completely break down: the Saturday after Thanksgiving. Here's why this particular Saturday was different. Thanksgiving had become a fixed national holiday on the fourth Thursday of November, thanks to Franklin D. Roosevelt's proclamation in 1939. This meant that the Friday after Thanksgiving was always a long weekend for many workers, especially government employees and those in industries that followed federal holiday schedules. For suburban families, this created the perfect storm. They had Thursday off for Thanksgiving. Many had Friday off as well. And then came Saturday, their traditional shopping day. But instead of being just another Saturday, this became a 3-day weekend where families could make the trip into Philadelphia for serious Christmas shopping. The numbers were staggering. On a typical Saturday, Philadelphia's downtown shopping district might see 50,000 to 75,000 visitors. But on the Saturday after Thanksgiving, that number would explode to over 200,000 people, all trying to navigate a downtown area that simply wasn't designed to handle those crowds. The city's infrastructure was buckling under the pressure. The subway system, which had been built in the early 1900s, was completely overwhelmed. The Broad Street line and Market Frankford line would be packed beyond capacity, with people literally unable to board trains. The situation above ground was even worse. Philadelphia's street grid, much of which dated back to William Penn's original city plan from 1682, simply couldn't handle the volume of cars trying to navigate downtown. Market Street, the main shopping thoroughfare, would become a parking lot of frustrated drivers circling endlessly looking for parking spaces that didn't exist. But the real problem wasn't just the crowds, it was what the crowds brought with them. This is where our story takes a crucial turn, because the people who really coined the term Black Friday weren't retailers or shoppers, they were the Philadelphia Police Department. Officer Frank Rizzo, who would later become Philadelphia's police commissioner and then mayor, was working the downtown beat during these chaotic shopping days in the early 1960s. In interviews years later, Rizzo and his fellow officers painted a picture of absolute mayhem that most people today can't even imagine. It was like trying to control a riot that happened every year, Rizzo once said in a 1975 interview with the Philadelphia Inquirer. Except the rioters were suburban housewives with shopping bags. The police department's problems began early in the morning and lasted well into the night. Starting around 8 a.m., cars would begin pouring into downtown Philadelphia from the suburbs. The Pennsylvania Turnpike, which connected the western suburbs to the city, would back up for miles. The Benjamin Franklin Bridge, connecting Philadelphia to New Jersey, would become a bottleneck that created traffic jams stretching back into Camden. But the real chaos began when these suburban shoppers actually reached downtown. Philadelphia's parking infrastructure was completely inadequate for the influx. The city had perhaps 15,000 downtown parking spaces, but was trying to accommodate 50,000 or more vehicles. This created a phenomenon that police officers began calling the circling. Cars would drive in endless loops around the downtown shopping district, desperately searching for parking. These weren't just a few cars, we're talking about thousands of vehicles, all moving slowly through the same narrow streets, creating massive traffic jams that would paralyze entire sections of the city. The police department was forced to deploy nearly every available officer to downtown traffic duty. Officers who normally worked in other parts of the city, detectives who usually handled serious crimes, even administrative personnel. Everyone was pressed into service trying to manage the traffic nightmare. Officer Joseph Barrett, who worked downtown traffic detail during this period, described the scene in a 1963 interview. You'd have women getting out of their cars in the middle of Broad Street, leaving their husbands to find parking while they went shopping. Cars abandoned in traffic lanes. Fender benders every few minutes. And everybody was angry: the drivers, the shoppers, the store employees who couldn't get to work. The situation was made worse by what police began calling the suburban phenomenon. These weren't city drivers who understood urban traffic patterns. These were suburban families who might come downtown only a few times a year, and they were completely unprepared for the chaos they encountered. Many suburban shoppers would panic when they couldn't find parking, leading to erratic driving that created even more traffic problems. Others would park illegally in fire lanes, blocking hydrants, double parking, anything to get out of their cars and start shopping. The police department was writing hundreds of parking tickets per hour, but it didn't matter because new violators were replacing the old ones faster than officers could keep up. But the traffic was only part of the problem. The massive crowds created public safety issues that the police department had never had to deal with before. The pedestrian situation was, if anything, worse than the traffic. Philadelphia's sidewalks, designed for a much smaller population, simply couldn't handle the volume of people trying to move through the downtown shopping district. Market Street, the main shopping corridor, would become so crowded that people couldn't move. We're not talking about slow walking. We're talking about human gridlock where people would be literally stuck in, placed for minutes at a time, unable to move forward or backward. The situation was particularly dangerous at store entrances. Department stores like Wanamaker's and Gimbel's would have lines stretching around entire city blocks. But these weren't orderly queues. They were massive crowds of people pushing and shoving, trying to get inside stores that were already packed beyond capacity. police officers began reporting incidents that sound almost unbelievable today. In 1962, a crowd outside Strawbridge and Clothier became so dense that several people fainted from the pressure and couldn't fall down. They were held upright by the crowd around them. Emergency medical personnel couldn't reach them because the crowds were too thick to navigate. The situation inside the stores was just as chaotic. Store employees, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of customers, couldn't maintain any sense of order. Checkout lines would snake through entire departments, creating confusion and frustration that often boiled over into arguments and occasionally physical altercations. Detective William Murphy, who worked crowd control during this period, described what he called shopping rage incidents where frustrated customers would get into fights over merchandise, parking spaces, or simply because they were overwhelmed by the chaos around them. "I saw things on those Saturdays that I never saw during actual riots," Murphy said in a 1964 interview. People completely losing their minds over a parking space or the last toy on a shelf. Suburban mothers getting into fistfights in the middle of Wanamakers. It was like the stress of the crowds brought out the worst in everyone. The police department began keeping detailed records of incidents that occurred on these chaotic shopping days. The numbers tell a remarkable story. On a typical Saturday, Philadelphia police might respond to 50 to 75 calls for service in the downtown shopping district. But on the Saturday after Thanksgiving, that number would jump to over 300 calls. These included traffic accidents, medical emergencies, fights, thefts, and what police reports began categorizing as crowd-related incidents. The medical emergencies were particularly concerning. The combination of massive crowds, stress, and physical exhaustion was causing people to collapse on the streets. Philadelphia General Hospital reported that their emergency room visits would triple on these shopping days, with most patients suffering from exhaustion, anxiety attacks, or injuries sustained in the crowds. But perhaps the most telling statistic was this: police sick leave requests would spike dramatically in the weeks following these chaotic shopping days. Officers were physically and emotionally exhausted from trying to manage crowds that seemed to grow larger and more unruly each year. It was in this context, dealing with what felt like an annual urban disaster, that Philadelphia police officers began using a term to describe these nightmarish shopping days. They called them Black Friday. The exact moment when the term Black Friday was first used is lost to history, but we can piece together how it emerged from interviews with Philadelphia police officers who worked during this period. The word black had a specific meaning in police terminology of the 1960s. It didn't refer to race, it referred to particularly difficult, dangerous, or chaotic situations. Police officers would talk about black days when everything seemed to go wrong, when they were overwhelmed with calls and couldn't keep up with the chaos around them. Officer Thomas McNeil, who worked downtown traffic detail from 1959 to 1967, explained the terminology in a 1975 interview. "We had different ways of describing bad days. A red day might be when we had a lot of serious crimes. A blue day was when we were short-staffed. But a black day, that was when everything was falling apart at once. When you couldn't get control of the situation, no matter what you did." The Friday after Thanksgiving had all the characteristics of a black day, but it was worse because it was predictable. Every year, officers knew that this particular day was going to be a nightmare. They would request extra shifts, cancel leave time, and mentally prepare for what they knew would be one of the most difficult days of their year. Sometime in the early 1960s, probably around 1961 or 1962, officers began specifically referring to the Friday after Thanksgiving as Black Friday. The term spread through the police department quickly because it perfectly captured how officers felt about working that day. But here's what's crucial to understand. This wasn't a term that the police department used publicly. This was internal slang, the kind of gallows humor that police officers used to cope with difficult situations. They weren't trying to create a marketing term or influence public perception. They were just trying to describe their own experience of dealing with annual chaos. The term might have remained internal police slang forever, except for one thing: journalists. Philadelphia had several major newspapers in the 1960s: the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Philadelphia Daily News, and the Philadelphia Bulletin. These papers regularly covered the traffic and crowd problems that plagued downtown Philadelphia during the holiday shopping season. And inevitably, journalists began talking to police officers about these problems. The first documented public use of the term Black Friday appeared in a Philadelphia Inquirer article on November 27, 1966. The article, written by reporter Nathan Cobb, was titled Army vs. Navy, A Dimming Splendor. It was primarily about the Army-Navy football game, which was held in Philadelphia that year, but it included this passage: "Police officers are not looking forward to tomorrow. They know it will be Black Friday, the day when downtown Philadelphia is turned into a madhouse by Christmas shoppers from the suburbs." This appears to be the first time the term appeared in print, but it's clear from the context that Cobb was using the term he had heard from police officers, not coining it himself. The article caused a minor stir, not because of the Black Friday reference, but because it highlighted just how serious the crowd control problems had become. City officials, who had been trying to downplay the chaos to protect Philadelphia's reputation as a shopping destination, were forced to acknowledge that something needed to be done. The publicity around the Black Friday chaos put pressure on Philadelphia city officials to address the problem. Mayor James Tate, who had taken office in 1962, was particularly concerned about the city's image. Philadelphia was competing with suburban shopping malls for retail dominance, and the last thing the city needed was a reputation for being chaotic and unmanageable. In 1967, the city launched what they called Operation Christmas Shopping, a comprehensive plan to manage the crowds and traffic that descended on downtown Philadelphia during the holiday season. The plan was remarkably sophisticated for its time. It included traffic management. The city installed temporary traffic lights at key intersections and deployed traffic officers at every major downtown intersection. They created one-way traffic patterns on shopping days and established designated routes for suburban traffic entering and leaving the city. Parking solutions. Philadelphia negotiated with suburban school districts to use their parking lots as staging areas. Shuttle buses would transport shoppers from these remote lots to downtown shopping areas. The city also temporarily converted several downtown parks into parking areas. Crowd control. Police officers were stationed at every major store entrance to manage lines and prevent dangerous overcrowding. The fire department was brought in to monitor store capacity and ensure that buildings weren't exceeding safe occupancy limits. Public transportation. The city added extra subway trains and buses on shopping days and extended service hours to accommodate the increased demand. Emergency services. Additional ambulances were stationed throughout the downtown area, and Philadelphia General Hospital was put on alert for increased emergency room traffic. The plan worked, sort of. The 1967 holiday shopping season was notably calmer than previous years. Traffic still backed up, crowds were still large, but the dangerous chaos that had characterized previous years was largely under control. But there was an unintended consequence: the media attention around Operation Christmas Shopping had introduced the term Black Friday to a much wider audience. Newspapers across the country picked up the story of Philadelphia's traffic and crowd problems. The term Black Friday began appearing in articles in New York, Washington, Boston, and other major cities. Retail trade publications wrote about the Black Friday phenomenon and how other cities might prepare for similar problems. By 1968, Black Friday was becoming a widely recognized term for the chaotic shopping day after Thanksgiving. But it still carried negative connotations. It was associated with traffic jams, overcrowding, and urban chaos. This is where the story takes another crucial turn, because the retail industry was paying attention to all of this coverage, and they didn't like what they were hearing. The retail industry in the late 1960s was going through a period of massive change. Suburban shopping malls were beginning to challenge downtown shopping districts across the country. Department stores that had anchored urban retail for decades were seeing their customer base migrate to suburban competitors. The last thing retailers wanted was for the biggest shopping day of the year to be associated with chaos, traffic jams, and urban problems. The term Black Friday, with its negative connotations, was exactly the kind of publicity that could drive suburban shoppers away from downtown stores and toward the controlled, convenient environment of suburban malls. The National Retail Federation, the industry's main trade organization, began discussing the Black Friday problem at their annual conferences. Internal memos from major department store chains show that executives were genuinely concerned about the negative associations the term was creating. In 1969, Gimbel's department store commissioned a public relations firm to study the Black Friday phenomenon and recommend strategies for changing public perception. The resulting report, which was circulated among major retailers, made several key recommendations. Reframe the narrative. Instead of focusing on crowds and chaos, retailers should emphasize the positive aspects of holiday shopping, family traditions, gift giving, and community celebration. Create alternative terminology. The report suggested that retailers begin using terms like Big Friday or Bargain Friday instead of Black Friday. Emphasize economic benefits. Retailers should highlight the economic importance of holiday shopping and frame large crowds as a sign of economic prosperity rather than urban chaos. But the most significant recommendation was this: retailers should create their own explanation for the term Black Friday that would replace the negative police-originated meaning. This is where the Red to Black story was born. Sometime in the early 1970s, retail industry publications began promoting a new explanation for the term Black Friday. According to this version, Black Friday referred to the day when retailers' financial ledgers went from showing losses, traditionally recorded in red ink, to showing profits, recorded in black ink. This explanation was neat, positive, and perfectly aligned with the retail industry's interests. It transformed Black Friday from a term associated with urban chaos into a celebration of American commerce and economic prosperity. The problem? It was completely made up. The red to black explanation has several obvious flaws that anyone familiar with retail accounting would immediately recognize. Timing issue. Most major retailers don't become profitable for the year on a single day in November. Retail profitability is measured over much longer periods, typically quarters or full years. Accounting practices. By the 1970s, most major retailers had moved away from handwritten ledgers with colored ink. Financial records were increasingly computerized, and the red-black ink distinction was becoming obsolete. Historical inaccuracy. There's no evidence that retailers were using the term Black Friday to describe their accounting practices before the 1970s. All documented uses of the term prior to 1970 refer to the Philadelphia police usage. Seasonal reality. For most retailers, the period between Thanksgiving and Christmas represents about 20 to 25% of their annual sales. While important, it's not typically the difference between annual profit and loss. Despite these obvious problems, the red to black explanation began appearing in retail trade publications, press releases, and eventually in mainstream media coverage of Black Friday. The transformation was remarkably successful. By the mid-1970s, many Americans had heard both explanations for the term Black Friday, the original police version about urban chaos, and the newer retail version about accounting profits. But the retail version was much more appealing and easier to understand, so it gradually became the dominant explanation. This process was helped along by the fact that the original Philadelphia police officers who had coined the term were retiring or moving on to other assignments. The institutional memory of how the term really originated was fading, while the retail industry was actively promoting their preferred version. By 1980, most Americans believed that Black Friday referred to retail profitability. The original story about Philadelphia police and urban chaos had been largely forgotten. But the myth-making didn't stop there. As the retail industry successfully rebranded Black Friday from a term of chaos to a celebration of commerce, something interesting began to happen. The day itself began to change. In the 1970s and 1980s, retailers started to embrace Black Friday as a marketing opportunity rather than just enduring it as an annual ordeal. If this was going to be the biggest shopping day of the year anyway, why not make it even bigger? Department stores began advertising special Black Friday sales with deep discounts available only on that day. The strategy was simple. If you're going to have massive crowds anyway, you might as well give them a reason to spend more money. This marked a fundamental shift in how Black Friday was perceived and experienced. What had started as an organic phenomenon, suburban families naturally choosing to shop on, their day off was becoming a carefully orchestrated retail event. The changes were dramatic. Extended hours. Stores began opening earlier and staying open later on Black Friday. What had once been normal shopping hours became 12-hour or even 24-hour shopping marathons. Doorbuster deals. Retailers introduced limited quantity items at extremely low prices, available only to the first customers through the door. This created a sense of urgency and competition that drove even larger crowds. Advertising blitzes. Black Friday sales began to be advertised weeks in advance, with elaborate newspaper inserts and television commercials, building anticipation for the shopping event. National expansion. What had started as a Philadelphia phenomenon began spreading to other cities as retailers recognized the profit potential of creating artificial shopping frenzies. By the 1990s, Black Friday had become a national institution. But it was a very different phenomenon from what those Philadelphia police officers had experienced in the 1960s. The crowds were larger, but they were more organized. The chaos was still there, but it was managed chaos, carefully orchestrated by retailers who had learned how to profit from the madness. And the negative connotations had been almost completely erased. Black Friday was now seen as a fun family tradition rather than an urban nightmare. But there was a cost to this transformation, and it's one that we're still paying today. As Black Friday evolved from an organic shopping phenomenon into a carefully managed retail event, some disturbing trends began to emerge. The competition for doorbuster deals created a level of aggression among shoppers that went far beyond what those Philadelphia police officers had dealt with in the 1960s. People began camping out overnight in front of stores, creating temporary communities of competitive shoppers who saw each other as obstacles to overcome rather than fellow customers. The first documented Black Friday violence occurred in 1983, when a crowd of shoppers at a Cabbage Patch Kids sale in a New York toy store became so aggressive that several people were hospitalized. But this was just the beginning. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, Black Friday violence became increasingly common. Shoppers were trampled, shot, stabbed, and pepper sprayed in pursuit of discounted merchandise. The National Retail Federation began tracking Black Friday incidents, and the numbers were sobering. 2008, a Walmart employee in New York was trampled to death by a crowd of shoppers rushing through the doors. 2010, a woman in California pepper sprayed other shoppers to get to a discounted Xbox. 2011, a shooting in a California Walmart parking lot left one person dead. 2012, multiple incidents of violence were reported at stores across the country. The irony was stark. Retailers had successfully transformed Black Friday from a term associated with urban chaos into a celebration of American commerce. But in doing so, they had created something far more dangerous than the original Philadelphia traffic jams. The crowds were larger, the competition was fiercer, and the stakes felt higher. What had once been frustrating but relatively harmless urban congestion had become an annual ritual of consumer violence. The rise of e-commerce in the 2000s began to change Black Friday once again. Online retailers, led by Amazon, recognized that they could capture the Black Friday shopping frenzy without the physical limitations and safety concerns of brick-and-mortar stores. Cyber Monday was invented in 2005 as the online equivalent of Black Friday. The term was coined by the National Retail Federation, the same organization that had helped promote the Red to Black myth decades earlier to encourage online shopping on the Monday after Thanksgiving. But something interesting happened. Instead of replacing Black Friday, online shopping began to extend it. Black Friday deals started appearing online days or even weeks before the actual Friday. Black Friday week became Black Friday month, the original time-bound, location-specific phenomenon that had overwhelmed Philadelphia in 1960s was becoming a diffuse extended shopping season that existed primarily in digital space. This transformation accelerated dramatically during the COVID-19 pandemic. With physical stores closed or operating under capacity restrictions, Black Friday 2020 became primarily an online event. For the first time since the 1960s, there were no massive crowds overwhelming urban shopping districts. In a strange way, the pandemic brought Black Friday full circle. The chaos and crowds that had originally defined the day and given it its name were gone. What remained was the marketing concept that the retail industry had built around the original phenomenon. Despite decades of successful myth-making by the retail industry, the true origin of Black Friday never completely disappeared. Historians, journalists, and retail researchers continued to investigate the real story, and by the 2000s, enough evidence had emerged to definitively debunk the red to black explanation. In 2001, retail historian Michael Lisicki published Wanamaker's Meet Me at the Eagle, a comprehensive history of Philadelphia's most famous department store. The book included extensive interviews with former Philadelphia police officers who confirmed the original police origin of the term. Black Friday, in 2004, the Philadelphia Inquirer published a retrospective article titled Black Friday's True Origins that traced the term back to the police department's traffic and crowd control problems of the 1960s. In 2013, Snopes, .com, the fact-checking website, published a detailed analysis of Black Friday's origins that conclusively debunked the red to black myth and confirmed the Philadelphia police story. But perhaps the most compelling evidence came from the police officers themselves. In the 2000s, several retired Philadelphia police officers who had worked during the original Black Friday chaos began speaking publicly about their experiences. Officer Frank Rizzo Jr., son of the former police commissioner, gave interviews confirming that his father and other officers had used the term Black Friday to describe the chaotic shopping day long before retailers adopted it. Detective William Murphy, who had worked crowd control in the 1960s, told the Philadelphia Daily News in 2006, "We called it Black Friday because it was the worst day of our year. Nothing to do with profits or accounting. It was just a black day for anyone who had to work downtown." These first-hand accounts, combined with newspaper archives and police department records, painted a clear picture. The retail industry's explanation for Black Friday was a complete fabrication, created to replace an inconvenient truth with a more marketable myth. Today, Black Friday is a global phenomenon worth hundreds of billions of dollars. It has spread far beyond the United States to countries around the world, many of which don't even celebrate Thanksgiving. The day has spawned numerous imitators: Cyber Monday, Small Business Saturday, Giving Tuesday, creating an entire ecosystem of themed shopping events. But the true story of Black Friday's origins offers some important lessons about how myths are created and how Historical truth can be obscured by commercial interests. The transformation of Black Friday from a police term describing urban chaos to a retail celebration of consumer capitalism is one of the most successful rebranding efforts in American history. It shows how powerful interests can literally rewrite history when it serves their purposes. The retail industry didn't just change how people thought about Black Friday, they changed what Black Friday actually was. They took a phenomenon that had emerged organically from the intersection of urban geography, suburban demographics, and transportation infrastructure, and turned it into a carefully managed marketing event. In the process, they erased the experiences of the Philadelphia police officers who had actually coined the term. They obscured the real urban planning and crowd control challenges that had given rise to the original phenomenon. And they replaced a complex story about American cities, suburbs, and consumer culture with a simple myth about retail accounting. But perhaps most importantly, the Black Friday story shows how historical memory works in a commercial society. The version of history that survives isn't necessarily the most accurate one, it's the one that serves the most powerful interests. The Philadelphia police officers who first used the term Black Friday weren't trying to create a lasting piece of American culture. They were just trying to describe their own experience of dealing with an annual urban crisis. They had no way of knowing that their internal slang would eventually become a global shopping holiday worth hundreds of billions of dollars. And they certainly had no way of knowing that their role in creating this phenomenon would be almost completely erased from the historical record. The real origin of Black Friday teaches us several important lessons about American culture, commerce, and historical memory. First, it shows us how organic social phenomena can be captured and commercialized by powerful interests. What started as a natural consequence of suburban demographics and urban geography was transformed into a managed retail event designed to maximize profits. Second, it demonstrates how historical narratives can be deliberately constructed to serve commercial purposes. The red to black explanation for Black Friday wasn't just wrong. It was a conscious attempt to replace an inconvenient truth with a more marketable myth. Third, it reveals how quickly historical memory can be lost, especially when there are powerful interests working to obscure it. Within just a few decades, the retail industry's version of Black Friday's origins had become so dominant that most Americans believed it was true. But perhaps most importantly, the Black Friday story reminds us to be skeptical of official explanations, especially when they seem too neat or convenient. The truth is often messier, more complex, and more interesting than the myths that replace it. Those Philadelphia police officers who first called the day after Thanksgiving Black Friday were describing something real, the chaos that ensued when America's growing suburban prosperity collided with urban infrastructure that couldn't handle the crowds. Their experience was authentic, immediate, and unfiltered by commercial interests. It deserves to be remembered, not just as a historical curiosity, but as a reminder that behind every major cultural phenomenon, there are real people dealing with real problems in real time. The next time you hear the phrase Black Friday, remember where it really came from. Remember the traffic-jammed streets of Philadelphia in the 1960s. Remember the overwhelmed police officers working double shifts to manage crowds they were never trained to handle. Remember the suburban families circling downtown blocks for hours looking for parking spaces that didn't exist. That's the real origin of Black Friday. And it's a story worth telling, even if it's not the story that retailers want you to hear. The truth, as they say, is often stranger than fiction. And in the case of Black Friday, it's definitely more interesting than the sanitized corporate myth that replaced it. So the next time someone tells you that Black Friday is called Black Friday because it's when retailers go from red to black, you'll know better. You'll know the real story, the story of Philadelphia police officers, suburban shoppers, and urban chaos that spiraled into one of America's biggest cultural phenomena. And you'll know that sometimes The most important stories are the ones that powerful interests would prefer you forget.